Hey Valerie, good to see you. Last time we caught up was about a month before the tariffs, and at that time we were discussing about how confident Vietnam felt. It had promised to buy lots of planes from America. It had built a golf course in Vietnam. It had also dropped its own internal tariffs on US goods preemptively.
Yeah,
So they felt good before Liberation Day
yeah,
tariffs. And unfortunately, I think it came out with America having reciprocal tariff 46%. Yeah, so yeah, it's even higher than I remembered. And the way they had calculated it was like, hey, Vietnam is ripping us off by
yeah,
a lot more than that.
yeah,
And so 46% is very fair because it was only half.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
was just curious, like, what was the reaction of the Vietnamese
Y-
government and people?
Yeah, first of all, on the reaction of the people, we were all like shocking and
Yeah.
very overwhelming. It's a direct hit to a lot of business activity, daily life,
Mm,
and business planning
mm,
were completely crushed.
mm,
There was some very rash decision. Some people actually even committed suicide because the clients from the cut off their order last minute. And before that, they already for the suppliers and they already took out some very expensive debt to pay for orders.
mm,
And then the last minute partners in the US saying, hey, because of the tariff, we can
mm,
no longer do business with you, the factory in Vietnam.
mm,
So unfortunately, I heard horrible stories of people did not think rationally and
mm,
being extremely scared and fear,
mm,
and that's why they committed suicide.
mm,
Of course, all of us were shocked and to take react really fast,
mm,
and that's also shown in our government action. So
mm,
immediately that night, like around 10 p.m., 11 p.m., all of our government had an emergency meeting, and the general secretaries actually called Donald Trump that night and asked for negotiation.
mm,
And he's willing to cut tariff down to zero
mm,
for US to make a deal here.
mm,
But then after that, the US was saying even if we reduce our tariff to zero, it's
mm,
not enough because right now they don't have fair trade. We raise barriers to the US, we manipulate our currency, and we have to make this 20 billion surplus lower, which is still very concerning for us because actually Vietnam foreign currency reserves only 90 billion. So how do you balance that trade surplus? We already emergency committee delegations to navigate negotiation conversations. Also, a delegation already flew into US to initiate and start this negotiation conversation.
mm.
So we have to take swift actions. We were all shocked. The VN index lost 40 billion in 3 days. Yeah, I think shocking is even an understatement.
Yeah, I think all of us were shocked. Obviously, for Singapore, it was shocked because it's a free trade agreement. So by law,
Yeah,
this will be 0-0 on each. And then Singapore buys more from America than it sells to America. America has a trade surplus. And so Singapore still got hit by 10%.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
think we were shocked. But of course, 10% is like very painful, but you can close
Mhm.
your eyes.
Mm.
I think we were shocked that Southeast Asia as well, so much. Cambodia was like
Yeah.
49%. Malaysia and Indonesia were like 20 plus percent, 30
Hmm.
plus percent.
Yeah.
So I think that was really bad because for us as Southeast Asia as a whole, where Singapore is like a hub,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
then it was also very negative for Singapore because it was like, okay, all the exports from Vietnam would
Hmm.
go through Singapore
Hmm.
to America, the financing would be arranged through Singapore. And so there was a lot of shock as well. I'm just curious because let's focus on maybe the people side and then we'll talk
Hmm.
about the government side. And then after that, obviously, Trump has made some updates to his moves over time. And also, he's made some moves on China as well.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting about the people perspective was that in our last episode, we talked about how people were actually pretty okay with Trump being the winner of the US elections because they felt that he was more anti China.
Yeah.
You share a little bit more, it must have been quite a
Mhm.
swing of opinion for the people's perspective.
Yeah. I think I understand his intention
Yeah.
here in the Trump 2.0
Yeah.
era. He doesn't want to repeat the same mistake in the trade war that he has a loophole of Vietnam being the transshipment hub for a lot of Chinese manufacturing to just dock it in Vietnam and ship to US and avoid
Mm,
the tariff. So I think this is his intention to not repeat the same mistake.
mm,
But I think he did not think through this rationally
mm,
because we are starting to lose trust
mm,
on the administration because
mm,
we were such good partners.
mm,
We established comprehensive strategic partnership last year. We are gonna buy so many more airplanes and maybe LNG from them. And then suddenly we will hit with 46% and create a lot of chaotics and fears. So also that come with starting to lose lots of trust as well.
I can imagine because I think the big part was like there's the content of the tariff, which people are okay, we can get. And then there's also the process, right? Because there's no signaling,
Yeah.
there was no moderation, and it basically breaks a lot of trust, I think, the way it's done.
Yeah.
Which is actually important. Negotiation is not just about what you ask for, it's about how you ask for it. Otherwise, people just get pissed off. And then I think from a government perspective, there's an emergency meeting. Do you feel they also feel like they have trust America less? How does the government feel? Because they've been doing so many moves in advance of this.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I definitely think our government also feels a bit more cautious now. The first message that the government sent to people, the Vietnamese people, that is that we have, as a Vietnamese, we have been through a lot of hardship in the history, from wars and being sanctions and global financial crisis, and we survived it through it all by being resilient and by partnering and trading with many multiple parties and country, and we don't rely on one particular country. So that's the main message. And after that, I'm seeing like the government is inviting Xi Jinping to visit Vietnam officially, and he's landing in Vietnam tomorrow.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I see more business organizations are sending their delegation to UAE, to Europe, to other parts of the world, like Australia, to make sure we have some buffer if we lost a lot of business from. And also the manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing and factories owner are saying like, we now have to own their own designing process and their own branding process to not relying on, because traditionally these factories only do production. They don't own anything. They don't own brand, they don't own design, they don't own IP. And now the manufacturing owners are thinking differently, and they start to think, oh, we have to own end to end, and we have to diversify our trading partners.
Yeah.
Even though those markets might be smaller than the US right now, but if we start early and take action early, it's safe so much more. And it's,
Yeah. I think what's really interesting that comes out there is that if one outcome is whether the tariff happens or not, I think it's actually backfired in a way because America wants to be at the top of the value chain and obviously moves the manufacturing back. Of course, the pushback now here is like you're saying is that the Vietnamese factory owner wants to move up the value chain, which is like becoming independent of the American like, top of the pyramid, if that makes sense. And then also is pushing the rest of the countries into the multipolar world. America used to be the pole, and then now everyone's like, it become the friendly relationship that we had doesn't work anymore, and so we have to be friends with everybody else, and then the rest of the poles are going to like go up, which is China, and Australia and India and so forth.
Europe.
Exactly.
Yeah, Middle East.
So what's interesting is that you said that Vietnam invited Xi Jinping to visit, right? And so by the time this podcast episode comes out, the whole visit is done. Officially, I think they say that there's going to be about 40 over deals that'll be signed. Of course, a large chunk of them are non-binding, but a lot of them has to do like real infrastructure and so forth. But let's talk about this because it's not just USA and Vietnam, right? But also China also got hit with a large amount of tariffs. So during the time frame that we had, Trump 1.0 had given some tariffs, then Trump 2.0 gave some additional tariffs. And then during the last round, he raised it even more. And then America raised it some more. And then now China's raised it. And I think China's now, and then now is about 125%. And the other one's 150%, I believe. So, and then I think China was like, okay, like no number beyond this makes any sense because 125% tariff basically means nothing is going to flow because nothing has a 50-60% profit margin. You need 60% profit margin to... Anyway, but the key thing was that I think China said, effectively, I think signaled said it will stop retaliating this dimension, but it would probably do other measures to retaliate if Trump raises it. So it's going to be interesting. So how do the Vietnamese feel like about the Trump and China tariff? Is it like, okay, 46% is bad, but at least it's not 150%?
Our ideal scenario is tariff is zero, but right now he's pausing the tariff. So it's 10% right now. But we want zero, right? That's we just became comprehensive strategic partnership. So even 10% is quite outrageous because a lot of foreign companies that have invested a lot in Vietnam, like Samsung or Nike, or some more like furniture company from US, there are talk that they reconsidering.
Investments in
yeah,
Vietnam and
yeah,
productivity.
yeah.
So where would they go? Because technically, that's like what the goal of the American tariff policy is, right? Was that if Samsung reconsiders and says, "I'm going to build this in America,"
I don't think they can just make that action.
Yeah.
Like, it's a huge like capex investment, and that would take at least 3 to 5 more years if they want to move out of Vietnam. Yeah, and our government try our best to
Yeah.
not let them do it.
it's
Yeah,
through like subsidies or
yeah.
tax credits or
Yeah.
whatever it is to
Yeah.
incentivize them to stay, obviously.
And to that point,
Yeah.
we actually do more business with East Asian countries
Yeah.
and have more visitors from East Asian countries rather than US.
Yeah.
So do we sacrifice, like what do we sacrifice here? Like maybe we have more trading agreement with China, Korea, and Japan instead.
Yeah. So let's talk about that because you said that Vietnam invited Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like Xi Jinping inviting himself,
Invited Xi Jinping.
and it was after the tariff.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like a pre-arranged
No.
visit.
No.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
We invited him, like I said, we are taking action.
Yeah.
The message from the government is we are resilient
Yeah.
and we are more like dynamic and we don't rely on one country because that's what it takes to be independent as a smaller nation. Yeah.
And so you talked previously about the bamboo strategy, which is stay independent but the wind is blowing. So I guess Vietnam is bending towards where the wind is blowing, which is from the east.
Geographically.
So I guess it's not just as obviously a way to do business with the Chinese, but also I guess it's a signal to America.
Yeah.
If you keep having these high tariffs, and
Yeah.
even though I think the tariffs are paused, it's only
Yeah.
10% for the next 90 days. I think it's a signaling to say, hey, if we don't play ball, then we have no choice but to swing to China.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
I think so, but at the same time, we are still trying to make a deal here, and that's why we have the entire delegation in the U.S. Like Vietnam Airlines just signed $500 million deals with Citibank,
Yeah.
and Citibank will sponsor them to. At the same time, where that deal happened, Vietjet, which is another airline in Vietnam, also inked a new deal to buy at least like 300 million worth of Boeing. So we are making actions for worst case scenario. Yeah. We don't want to say we are going with the East Asia country only, but we just want to prepare for the worst.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I think one question in my head is what does that future look like if you spin the clock and we try to make a prediction of 1 year out? I think we're going to land on it. There would be some tariffs still on USA, on Vietnam. It probably is higher than 10%. I don't know I don't know.
Okay,
why,
so my prediction, best case scenario,
Yeah.
is 10%. And but the condition here is we will not take any Chinese manufacturing that want to move to Vietnam. We have to say no. I think that's what Donald Trump is asking for. We cannot cooperate too much with the Chinese. We cannot give them a deal here. If we want 10% tariff, we cannot let this loophole of Vietnam being a transshipment happen again, like trade war 1.0.
Yeah, so I guess the deal would be no more China investment into Vietnamese, let's say, factories, but you can allow the Japanese, the Koreans, the Singaporeans to still have capital.
Of course.
And of course the Americans as well.
Starlink just started a project in Vietnam.
Yeah. Do you think the Vietnamese government will do that deal?
I think it makes sense for them to do that deal
Yeah.
because just talking about economically talking.
Right.
Yeah. But in terms of politics, China might
And you push back, right? Because
China might push back.
Yeah.
The big brother might not let us take that deal.
Yeah.
So best case scenario, 10%.
Yeah. But you're saying is China will push back for sure in a scenario where China is okay with that. And also it's no face. That's the deal is made. I think my prediction is probably, I don't know. It's hard to predict.
But even 20% is still better than 46%.
Exactly.
And we have to guarantee that all the big guys like Samsung, Nike, Apple, Foxconn, Restoration Hardware, they have to keep doing business in Vietnam.
Yeah.
We have to guarantee that.
Yeah. Makes sense.
20% of our GDP.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's also interesting because now we're also talking about some of the other dynamics that are happening in the region, right? Ping will have visited by this time Malaysia, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And I guess actually are quite similar because they're also big exporters to the US.
Yeah.
Cambodia in the textiles and clothing industry.
Yep.
which is also effectively about half of their GDP. And textiles actually is a big chunk of it is Chinese owned factories. And then for Malaysia, obviously, they're exporting a lot of electronics to America as well. So interesting choice, I think, signaling. But I
Yeah.
think, obviously, I don't know about Vietnam, but I think for Cambodia and Malaysia, I think especially Malaysia, I think Malaysia will try not to signal too much. Oh, we're very in favor of Xi Jinping. I think it'll just be like a more of a neutral business because they don't want to piss off
Either
the
side.
American administration if they're too friendly to Xi Jinping. So for Malaysia, they're going to be focused on not signaling too much that they're in China's camp. I think again it's about a signal to America that they can work more with China if they need to. And so I think it works for everybody. And China is also a good signal for them to be like, we can work with Malaysia as well. So lots of signaling happening as people try to negotiate for the next 90 days. When we think about this, what do you think about the dynamic? Because China is going to be visiting Cambodia and Vietnam and Malaysia. Cambodia, Vietnam, and China have had a long history. Could you share a little bit more about what you're thinking?
Yeah, so I'm thinking this is the beginning of a new world order
Yeah.
and further reiterating on the idea that you cannot rely on one party alone. You have to diversify. If you remember, last year we talked about China investment to Cambodia's newest canal projects. This year they actually pulled down and slowing down the investments and yeah, the commitment has not been funded at all. And that's why the Cambodian government has to make an emergency trip to Vietnam. They actually drive to Vietnam. And usually the political meetings are taking place in Hanoi, where our capital is. But our government actually made an exception and flew down to Ho Chi Minh City to meet with the Cambodian delegations. So I don't know what exactly they are discussing and what's the deal here. I'm also curious, but it seems Cambodia want to make peace with Vietnam and maybe want us to invest in this kind of project instead because China has stepped down their commitment and it seems like there's no more investment from China.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts, right? One is what does it mean for Cambodia, and the second part is obviously the signaling from China about why they're doing it.
Yeah.
But I think to recap the context here is that Cambodia is obviously smaller than Vietnam, obviously smaller than China.
Yeah.
And 50% of its economy is in textiles, which a lot of it is Chinese owned. But I think they're pushing very hard to upgrade the infrastructure, right? I think there are two major infrastructure deals. One is the canal project,
Yeah.
and it's supposed to help them become less reliant on the river that primarily goes through Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I think in a previous episode that we talked about how it helps them basically have more control over sea, right? So it's very important for them. It's a $1.7 billion investment, and we thought that was going through at that point of time when we recorded the episode last year.
Yeah.
But it looks like it's frozen. And then also they are working on upgrading the airport, right? And the capital city. And there's also a $1.1 billion investment. And apparently China has also frozen or suspended that capital. So I think it's not just the canal, but it's also more broadly a freeze on investments flowing from China to Cambodia. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting piece that is going to be happening.
Yeah. I think China has its own internal issue
Right.
to prioritize over investment to Cambodia right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because the timing of also all of this happened after the November US election. So my perspective on it is very simple. It's like they were like, okay, we started this Belt and Road Initiative back when we were very strong and had a lot of money. And now our domestic consumption through the property market is very weak.
Yeah.
We need to stimulate our own economy. And now that Trump has come to power, we need even more to save our bazooka for our internal stimulus. So there's this, okay, we need to pull this money together. I think it's less about Cambodia and more about China.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. Also, like I think Hun Sen, which is the last kind of leader of Cambodia, now his son has taken over.
Yeah.
So this is the first time that he's going to be meeting Xi Jinping, I believe, in person.
Yeah.
And Xi Jinping meeting him. So it'll be interesting to see what that
Yeah.
relationship is
And
going to be.
the new generation might have some new ideas.
Yeah. The thing is that his son was educated in the US, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, he's probably had McDonald's, so walked around Starbucks and did a road trip in America.
Yeah.
Actually, it's quite compelling when you do that and you're like, wow, America is so nice and free. And
Yeah.
But of course, Cambodia has been hit by 49% tariffs. So it's also
49%.
quite a huge problem for them as well.
Yeah. Vietnam and Cambodia are economy colonies of China.
Yeah.
That's why we were hit with the highest tariff.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be tricky for them.
Yeah.
I think when I look at it, the questions that we have, and I was talking with a Swiss delegation that was just in town, and for me, I think the questions that came out were like three of them. And one was, is this the change, right, of the economic order where
Yeah.
America was number one and everyone's working with them based
Yeah.
on what we thought they wanted and so forth. And then number two, is this going to be a change in the security architecture?
Yeah.
Where America, because of its trading links and because it wants to preserve freedom of navigation in the seas, is it going to step back from its role as an offshore balancer to the
Yeah.
security arrangement in the whole of Asia? And then the third question is, what do the other countries do with one another? How will the countries say, diversify, create new multipolar
Yeah.
trade with each other?
But one thing I know for sure is this is a kind of signaling the beginning of a new world. And we have to protect ourselves by diversifying our trading partners and friends. And that's why we established formal comprehensive strategic partners with Singapore and Indonesia for the past 2 months. And yeah, we saw official visit of Vietnam, the General Secretary to Singapore, and then reverse Lawrence Wong also a visit to Vietnam. So we need to make the region internally stronger and friendlier with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think last year I was part of a delegation from Singapore to Vietnam just to visit and work on the education tech space, which has a lot of interest because Vietnam and Singapore both love education. And I think it was just so nice to be warmly received by
Yeah.
local folks who were
Yeah.
just hanging out.
No, because you come with good intentions.
Yeah.
And Hong also became viral in Vietnam.
He became viral. How does he become viral? Did he do a dance or
So
what?
he has a TikTok account and he has 2 TikTok short on Vietnam visit. And somehow he knows all the trendiest music in Vietnam. And immediately, like 3-4 days after the song was launched, he used that song for his TikTok short. And the singer is really like famous and popular in Vietnam. So I'm like amazed. How did he know about this song was just launched 3 days ago? And the comments section on the TikTok of Lawrence Wong is full of Vietnamese, like just praising him, like, oh, this is so cool. We love Singapore. We love Lawrence Wong. This is so hot. Yeah, it's amazing.
He's just a very authentic guy, and I think that's why he was selected, and that's how he's currently running for re-election in Singapore. So he does have that charisma in an authentic way. He plays the guitar, speaks pretty well. In fact, he also went viral in American media because he did a speech to Singaporeans saying, hey, this tariff situation is really bad. And he explained the economics system of it. I don't think you're attending this because I messaged about 1 to 2 months on Twitter. And then all the Americans were, wow, a prime minister can speak so well about economics. There was no music. There's just a guy looking serious, looking at the camera in his office, which is quite utilitarian. But yeah, it's interesting because I think Singapore has actually been weirdly improving PR through short form video, which is a crazy innovation. Part of it was because the government was very focused on newspapers and TV, which is old school. But then it was identified in the past few elections that the government was not, or the ruling party was not good at new media. So there's been like a weird push, obviously, to win voters, young voters, and Gen Z voters. But it's also been interesting because now, in Singapore, you have like police stations, Ministry of Defense, fire stations. The individual fire stations have their own TikTok accounts and Instagram accounts, and they're all competing to make public safety announcements, educational and entertainment, right? Edutainment.
Yeah, it's working.
Next time, there was a time when the Shangri-La Dialogues, the Ministry of Defense, they made TikTok.
Yeah.
And they did the song, what's the song called?
The viral
song, which was like looking for a man in finance.
Yeah, just fun.
Blue eyes, 6'5", something like that. And then they just made that version at the military version, so it's like showing all these like majors and generals and captains at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is the annual defense summit between China, America, and all these other places. And so we went viral. And so there's there's an army of like people just making TikToks in Singapore. It's crazy.
Very cool.
But on that note, time flies, and probably see you next month.
Thank you.